Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Today, we are talking payroll, and we are talking a recent white paper that we have launched called Payroll Starts with the Foundations. It's been written as a collaboration across our payroll team, but spearheaded by a regular contributor towards the podcast, Mr. Chris Kirby. How are you doing, sir? You all right? Back again.
I'm very good, thanks, Chris. Pleased to be back.
Good to have you on, as always. We've got a newbie to play with today from the payroll team. It's Nick Osborne-Moore. How are you doing, Nick? You okay?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Now, Nick, I have given you a pre-warning that we have a fundamentally different question before we get into the detail of the white paper itself, explaining why we've written the white paper and also some of the sections. But it might be quite nice, just because this is your first time on the pod, if you can just explain a little bit about your background for the benefit of our listeners. And there's also a reason why I've done that, because you've got that kind of operational side that Chris Kirby's going to riff off of when we talk about some of the sections of the white paper. So tell our listeners a little bit around yourself and your background.
For sure. So my background is a little bit different for payroll. I originally started in retail. So I had a career in retail spanning like over 15 years. I joined Dr. Martin, managing a few stores there. Then I moved into a head office role. So I started in TA and then got brought into payroll to support on a project, and then remained there for 3 years working purely in the payroll operational space for UK and EU.
Nice. Brilliant. And with that hat on, because you're a lacer, but we're going to ask you to draw on that hat, that operation side hat. We're going to talk about some of the sections here. But before we do that, we're going to hit our fundamentally different question. Chris Kirby, you're going to go first as a pro at this. Just read an article about a Norwegian man. He's a seriously deep sleeper, and he woke up one morning to find that a 135-meter long container ship had ran aground into his back garden about 2 meters away from where his house is. So my random question to you, if this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, we do a fundamentally different question each week, which has absolutely nothing to do with HR or payroll. Mr. Kirby, what are you choosing if you can have one thing land in your garden or arrive in your garden when you wake up in the morning and you open the shutters or the curtains to look in? What would give you the biggest surprise?
I think right now it would actually, I'm going to cheat. It might actually be something that's gone, because I recently decided I didn't want the front lawn anymore. So I've dug it up, but now we have 2 mounds of soil just laying in our front garden. So it would be quite nice to wake up and a digger had been overnight and that wasn't there anymore. But the direct answer to the question, I think it would probably just be a delivery for maybe a set of golf clubs.
The big surprise for me would be if I woke up in the morning and found all of your dirt and turf in my front garden. Now, that would be random and a surprise. Nick, we've given you a few seconds to think about it. So what are you going for?
I think I'll come at this from a different angle. Mine's definitely a bit more impossible. So a winning lottery ticket, that would be lovely. Imagine that. I don't know how you'd spot it because it would be very small, but equally, what a brilliant surprise that would be, right?
Oh. Anyway, that randomness aside, we need to talk about this fabulous white paper that you guys have written. Chris Kirby, I'm going to start with you just to kick us off. Let's explain a little bit about the white paper. I think really it's why we decided to put together some of our thinkings around this idea of the foundations of payroll. And then, we'll get into the detail of what we call 7 pillars of payroll.
I think in a nutshell, it's an attempt to bring together what it takes to have an optimal payroll function. Certainly in my background in operations, I've dealt with each of the foundations at one time or another. As a consultant, I deal with them all regularly with different clients. And I guess I'd probably almost bored myself saying the same thing over and over again around actually stepping back from things like symptoms and looking for the causes and addressing the fundamental problems. I think the market is full of content and information around each specific thing. There's so much content around technology, why it might not be working and what you can do about it. But to achieve the optimal payroll function, you need a lot more than each of those things in place. And the white paper is an attempt to bring all of that together and highlight what it takes to run an optimal payroll function rather than just looking at component or individual things that may go wrong today.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually. I liked the way that it's laid out as well. And I think as well, what you're describing there and what you describe in the white paper, and we talked about it a lot, the complexity of working within a payroll function. Everybody that's in employment, you get paid by your employer. And what happens is the money goes into your account and you get some kind of a digital pay slip. And all you think about is the simple process of getting paid. But there's so much more underneath the bonnet, isn't there? And so I think what this does, what I like about it, is it opens up the world of, do you know what? Payroll is a complex subject. It's got lots of different elements of it. And to get a world-class, best-in-class payroll function, there are some things you've got to do, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think you're right as well around that. It's a perception as well of payroll. And I think the fact that ultimately if people are paid, we've kind of done our job, probably contributes heavily to that. But it's a perception that that is all payroll are there to do. I think the idea of working optimally is to help tackle that, because if you can make sure that day job, which is always going to be there, we're not here to say, oh, we want to stop payroll having to pay people accurately on time every month, but then that has to happen. If you can make that as optimal as possible, actually you free people up, you free resource up, be that people, technology, whatever, to be able to think differently and start to focus on how do we add value to the business? How do we support employees more in a different way and actually change the perception of what payroll's there to serve?
Yeah, and there's also an element of the swan analogy of what we see as employees is that payroll at the end, but there's all this stuff happening, ticking over as we go through. Right, so there are 7 sections that you guys have identified. I'll read them out and then we're through one by one. There's operating model, technology, skills and capabilities, data and reporting, process optimization, adaptability and scalability, and training and mindset. And Chris, can you just kick us off by a little bit of an overview around the operating model stuff? We've run a campaign over the last year, 18 months, which looks at demystifying HR's operating model, but we're talking specifically around the payroll side. So can you give us a flavor of this? And then Nick, give us that operational perspective. Chris, if you could kick us off.
Of course. I think you mentioned the HR operating model, and fundamentally, we're probably talking about very similar things, right? At a principal level, it's quite easy in payroll because of that tendency to just focus on get people paid. You start with how you do that, and then you work backwards and you kind of work around how that process needs to work, and that becomes your operating model. The whole concept of working optimally is, are you serving your business, right? Are you serving your satellite functions? So the likes of HR, the likes of finance, the likes of IT, are you serving those in a way that's effective? And are you meeting the demands of employees? And those demands change. You know, we could set an op model today that is set up to serve a business and its employees. And then in 5 years, that may be completely different because demands and expectations in the market and in the workforce have changed. So the operating model, it's not about saying so-and-so does this, so-and-so does this, so-and-so does this. It's about stepping back and saying, what's the best way we can serve the business? Are we aligned to serve the business properly? You know, if we've got a centralized payroll team with an outsourced provider, whatever it may be, but the business is actually aligned by business unit or by country, is that going to work? Is that ever going to work? As simple as things like language capability and stuff like that, but also culture and everything thrown in there. So it's just a step back and a refocus around, are we serving everybody we need to serve in the most optimal way?
And Nick, from your perspective and your previous roles, has this been an area of focus for the businesses, defining our operating model, understanding the organization, the employees? What impact did it play and what kind of advice can you give our listeners?
Interestingly, we started at a point where we didn't have a defined operating model. So we didn't have key roles and responsibilities. mapping those processes out and mapping the roles and responsibilities. And it's really important because it develops that kind of more collaborative culture. So all of the different kind of departments that you service and you work with, for example, your HR, your finance, your IT, having a more joined up focus and an operating model where everything's mapped out, you can work more collaboratively, but also more efficiently because you're able to look from a helicopter view of all your processes. It seems like a lot of work to map out all your processes and all your roles and responsibilities. But once it's done, you can then start looking at tweaks and making things more efficient. So I've been at both ends of the spectrum with nothing to then with quite a lot. You don't at the beginning understand the value of simply reading the white paper and you can read the pillar for sure. You understand what it means. But the real value add is once you get to that, almost that it's never really a final stage. You're always having a look and tweaking things. Once you get to that stage, looking back and seeing how far you've come along the journey.
I really like that. It's a constant refinement, similar to the technology approach as well, right? And that's pillar 2, because technology, as we've been saying in our Less Stress HRIS series, we can apply the same principles. The journey is never done because technology is never just, right, that's it. We've got our technology we've implemented and that's life, because you've got constant optimization that you need to do. So Chris, I want to bring you in just to give us a few thoughts around the technology pillar and its importance in terms of building those foundations.
You're right. All of this is an evolving picture, and that will come on to adaptability later, covering that expectation and requirement. From a technical perspective, people look at technology as the problem and the solution. People think payroll's not working properly, change provider, payroll's not working properly, change our system, upgrade our system. The likelihood of it just being the system, it's possible, of course, but it's very slim. And ultimately payroll, there's an old adage, if you don't put very good stuff in, not very good stuff comes out. Often the focus needs to be upstream of that. When we're talking about technology, the most important thing, I've covered this in the white paper, is it sounds really simple, but start with the requirements. And those requirements aren't just about what does 1 + 1 need to equal. The requirement is, what role do you need technology to play in your organization? So when you think about those other pillars, the operating model, for instance, at what point does technology come in and take over, factor in that employee lens? So we can choose the right technology to do the stuff we need it to for payroll, but what do employees need? Have they got self-service via a HCM tool upstream that the technology needs to support to maintain the employee experience? If not, do they need self-service? Is that something they need to access via mobile technology, etc.? But I think the key for me is starting with the requirements, not letting technology lead the requirements, is absolutely critical.
Nick, from your point of view, how heavily involved have you been in either new technology launches or optimizing what you've already got?
When I joined payroll, we'd already implemented a new system. So system implementation and move-in isn't something that I'm well versed in. However, I've been on the end of, we've got a new system. I think a common misconception with technology is that it's going to be the fix of everything, which it can. If you've got issues with your processes, implementing a new technology isn't like the plaster that you put over it. There's still going to be issues and then you've got to blame it on the technology. So I think that looking at your kind of where we've potentially had issues in the past, is actually looking at your data flows and making sure that everything flows effectively and as the business requires it to be, instead of doing all these different manual workarounds. And then you're not fixing the problem, you're just putting a plaster over it and making things less efficient when these systems are actually built to make things more. I've definitely seen it from that perspective, having your processes all sorted and data flows.
One of my favorite phrases, and I may have used this in the white paper, I can't recall, but one of my favorite phrases is indeed operationalized workaround. And I think that it's so common. People see a process as the process, but actually it's a workaround of something that either isn't working in a process or in a technology that's just become standard process and never been truly resolved.
Yeah. And then you end up with that workaround mindset, which becomes, I'm just going to keep doing it my way. And then you spend all this money on technology that you're not actually leveraging to. I want to come to the third pillar, which I think is an interesting one. And Chris, I feel like we've done a few podcasts around this, which is the skills and capabilities pillar. There's a really interesting stat in there that you guys did from a poll of our payroll community, which was 85% of organizations believe there should be a greater investment in the development and support of payroll to enhance their effectiveness and capabilities. And we had Nick Day on a live stream recently at the time of recording, talking about the future of payroll in terms of replacing jobs and its skills and capabilities, and how is payroll going to upskill itself. But can you just give us an overview of what we're talking about in this section?
Yeah, it touches a little on some of what Nick was saying, where with the right skills and capability across a function, when we talk about skills and capability, we're not talking about every single person having everything, right? We're talking about a function being equipped with the right skills and capability. And I think with that, you end up in a place where you don't have operationalized workarounds. One of the key things is about change. Change is something now more than ever that is a permanent fixture on most organizations' radar, whether it's because of the change in landscape, acquisitions, buyouts, relocation, or the change in demands of the workforce, the additional legislative demands coming from all the different bodies around the world. It's just something that's there permanently. And I think that sort of attitude around this is the process because this works, this is how we've always done it, is something that you need, right? People criticize it, but you need that solid foundation to build from. But that needs to be coupled with the mindset around, for instance, change and the capability around change. And a lot of that is the skills and the engagement. For example, being able to engage with the business, knowing what the people you're serving need, you need to be able to engage with them effectively. You need to build those relationships, etc. I try and look at everything as simply as possible, just because I have to. If you go back 15 years, there was a strong requirement for genuine, what I would call payroll skills and capability. How do you calculate this? I've been sat there in an operation 20 years ago with textbooks on my desk, with tax tables on my desk, everything like that. That's probably never truly going to fully go away, but I would comfortably sit here and say it's reduced by a significant percentage, probably 75% less requirement, because technology can do so much more. So those old school nitty gritty detailed payroll skills and capabilities are becoming less and less. And the focus is on the outward looking stuff. So that engagement, the skill stuff, the how can we support the business rather than just transact payroll, those sort of capabilities across a function.
And Nick, from your perspective, I'm quite interested to hear, and it doesn't just have to be within the business that you've worked within, but just when you've been to industry events and things like that. What do you see payroll professionals in terms of this kind of desire and acknowledgement that we don't want to be Chris Kirby from 20 years ago with lots of paperwork, we want to evolve, and there are new skills and there are new approaches, and communication and engagement is an important thing to us. We can't be a payroll team in a dark corner just processing people's pay records.
Yeah, I think the mindset has definitely completely shifted. I think that, if you were to cast your mind back a few decades ago, it was very transactional, just working out pay slips. I do think there's definitely a need for, as Chris mentioned, everything's evolving in this constant change, legislations, opening new countries as business expands. So you need to be more in tune with business needs. There is that business partnering element more so to payroll. And again, to echo what Chris says, within a team, you don't need everyone to tick every single box and wear every hat. As long as you've got it balanced in terms of skills and capabilities, then I think you're onto a winner. The landscape has definitely evolved compared to where it used to be.
Yeah, 100%. Right, we're going to kick on to pillar 4. It's all around data and reporting. You made a comment earlier, Chris. You put something in and you get something out, and that's certainly something that applies to this, doesn't it?
It does, but I think as a foundational tier of a payroll function, it can probably be summarized easily with transactional reporting and strategic reporting. Payrolls come from a place where it was probably 95% transactional reporting. We need all the information we need to make sure payroll's right. And has moved into a place where there's more demand for strategic reporting. So how actually can we utilize that data, leverage payroll's position as the place where it has to be accurate in an organization? So in theory, you've got everything in one place and it's accurate. So more of a demand on that sort of strategic reporting side, whether that be capacity sort of planning, recognizing demand, recognizing spending in certain areas or whatever that may be. I think the focus for me needs to be on making sure you have both. I think whether it's because of technology providers maybe overselling one or the other, or simply because of mindset and attitude of payroll functions only recognizing the need for one or the other, I think we see quite often an imbalance where, yes, we've got all these wizzy charts and graphs and we can help all these people with all this data, but actually we've got to join 15 different gross to nets together to get any form of payroll information. Or the opposite, where actually we get all of that consolidated. Our provider's amazing, but we have absolutely no visibility of any sort of trend analysis, being able to be ahead of any issues that may be supporting the business. For me, around reporting and on data, it's just about, Nick touched on earlier around that end-to-end focus. We'll cover some of the process in a moment as well, but it's about ownership, governance, and making sure it's accurate before it gets to payroll, not having the payroll function sitting there as the almost operationalized workaround as a safety net of the rest of the business's data. They're thinking about it end to end, making sure that pipeline feeding payroll is working optimally is the only way to get to a point where payroll can truly be optimal.
Yeah, and there's some interesting stats in here, which I'll give you, and then I want to get Nick's take on the report. 57% of organizations do not believe their business has a clear understanding of what constitutes payroll data, what it encompasses and how it should be handled, which is, again, touching on some of the bits that Chris was talking about. And 80% of businesses say they are unable to use payroll reporting for informed decision-making. Where was your organization at when it came to reporting, Nick? Were you part of those percentage stats that I gave you?
Yeah, at the very beginning, we did go on a bit of a journey. I think at the very beginning part of it, we definitely were part of that stat without a doubt. But during the end, we weren't in those roles and responsibilities, conversations and wider conversations with teams. We're able to kind of identify what the business needs from a reporting aspect. So then we're able to plug in the right data to the right areas of the business. For example, if finance needed a specific report, they didn't know it come from payroll, they were able to get that element themselves.
Yeah, I don't think it will surprise Chris to hear that as a bit of a case study. I'm going to move us on to pillar 5, which is process optimization, in which the inevitable AI klaxon will probably come off at some stage, Chris. But talk a little bit more broadly than let's just talking about that elephant in the room, as you mentioned in the white paper.
Yeah, and I think as I did in the white paper, let's just park it straight away. I think it's what everyone wants to talk about, right? We don't know what's coming. It might take over the world. Who knows? Especially when it gets to teach itself. But I think for now, the role AI can play in a payroll function should be seen as process. I think everyone sees it as technology. It's not there to be an all-encompassing technology yet, and we don't know that it ever will be. I think that's all I'll say on AI. Nick may want to offer something, but he might just go absolutely not as well. But I think from a process perspective, and I'll touch on what Nick said earlier around the end-to-end holistic view, that's the key here. Payroll processes, making sure they're documented, logged, clear, updated regularly, that people are following them. Adoption and adherence is a key metric that needs to be tracked. I think the key focus has to be on the end-to-end process. So a payroll process, it's probably somewhere around 50, 60% of the way through a process that a business is going through. Someone's been hired, they've been through their whole recruitment processes, onboarding processes, HR processes. They don't even know potentially that they've been through those separate processes. And then it gets to the point where payroll have to do something. It's imperative to make sure that whatever payroll's process is tied into that end-to-end process, both to make sure that the process is efficient and working as it should, but also to make sure that the employee is getting the right experience. They don't even need to know it's a payroll process, right?
Yeah, exactly. Nick, have you got any war stories around process optimization you want to share?
Yeah, I mentioned it at the beginning, so I potentially jumped the gun a little bit. But yeah, I think having that end-to-end process and also focusing on how they can evolve, how they can change and tweak. And as you get more sophisticated systems, potentially you need to then review your processes, optimize those to make sure things flow a lot better. So I think that a lot of people tend to think that once a process is fully mapped, that's it, that's done. It's not. It needs to be revisited whenever there is certain changes and refined if you can.
Yeah, 100%. Right, we're going to move on to pillar 6. And now we're starting to look forward to Chris, because this one's around adaptability and scalability. Talk to me about what we talk about here, particularly the stuff around future-proofing payroll and building capability as well, because I feel that's going to seamlessly segue us into the 7th pillar as well, which is around training and mindset. So if you want, you can do 2 at the same time, or we can tackle them separately.
We'll see how it goes. Let's see if I can. I think adaptability and scalability, it links back to the point we were discussing earlier around the changing landscape of businesses, right? And it's not just because of legislative changes. It's not just because of the more common acquisition sort of landscape that we find ourselves in. It's also because of changing employee expectations, stepping back from everything we've spoken about so far across things like the operating model, the technology and data reporting. Being adaptable and scalable means you can do more with the same. For everything you're doing, old adages again, but if you take a small cleaning company with 20 people, 15 people, whatever, you clearly need to operate very differently to a company with 2,000 employees. You then need to operate very differently for a company with 5,000 employees, then with 20,000, the sky's the limit. There comes a point in that trajectory where you can operate the same and you're working optimally. I'm not going to say where that number is, but ultimately being adaptable and scalable is about working in a way that a sudden increase in demand because of an acquisition, because of a change of legislation, because of a change of business strategy, whatever it may be, doesn't result in you needing to double your payroll headcount. Your processes, the way that you're working, are structured in a way that means they're sustainable and can take additional demand. The answer isn't just people and resource. The answer is making sure that those reports, for instance, are set up to handle everything, to make sure that the operating model is set up in a way that if something's coming in like that, actually you're set up in a way that you can just start be operating. I think the other point around adaptability and scalability is if you're a business that is strategically growing, changing frequently for whatever reason, if there's acquisition-based businesses, right? Then you need to be set up with processes and controls and structures around actually those things happening. So it can't be a surprise every time. So if a payroll function's working day to day and then suddenly they buy a business with 20% of the current headcount, there needs to be a process for that to be taken into the current way of working, maybe a temporary process where you operate in two ways, but with a view to get to a point within a fixed amount of time. And I think it's just becoming such a thing in the payroll market where this is more and more of the demand.
Nick, have you seen that too?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think the most important bit is that when the payroll team is built, it's built in a way that's focused on what's going to happen next instead of the now. I think we very much get in a little bubble of what's going on, but things change, things evolve, whether it's legislation, acquisitions, additional countries, etc. You need to have everything in a way where you can potentially almost copy and paste so you can have a similar model elsewhere instead of reinventing the wheel each time.
Yeah, we are almost out of time. So we're going to do the final pillar before I let you guys clock off. Training and mindset. I mentioned in the previous pillar, Chris, that I feel like it led into it because in the previous pillar, you talk about building capability. I think training and mindset is quite interesting. And one of the lines that we use, so I just want you to give us some thoughts on that in the white paper itself, building capability to support the business and the mindset to ensure best in class delivery, which I think is quite important, isn't it?
It is. And I failed shamelessly, didn't I, to segue into that from the previous.
You did, that's fine.
But at least we give it enough focus. I think the training point is probably very important, but in terms of covering it here, it's probably the minor of the two. Fundamentally, it's about making sure that people have access to the right training. And when I say right training, it goes back to, as you said, all those things we've spoken about already, the ability to recognize when something is becoming an operationalized workaround. So I think that coupled with legislative stuff with payroll, people will always need whatever comes along. I think the mindset bit, I almost think about that as a horizontal across all of these pillars, because fundamentally you need the right mindset to recognize things are an issue and to deliver and make a difference and to achieve that optimal payroll function. So whether it's the technology, you can look at that one way and go, it needs to do X, Y, Z, or you can look at it another way and go, actually, let's think about it holistically. What's the role it needs to play in our organization? That's mindset, skills and capability. As I said a moment ago, you can go, can people run payroll? That's a mindset. The other side of that is what does our payroll function need? And do our people have the skills, the capability? And if not, do they have the access to develop them? Do they have the appetite to develop them? All those things are a mindset, and you can apply it to everything that we've spoken about so far across the pillars.
Based on what Chris was saying, I'm inferring that arguably this pillar could be the most important because the way you were describing it goes across all of them. Do you think this might be one of the most important pillars?
For sure. And definitely the focus on mindset. And that's driven by the organization itself. So you need to have an organization that supports sharing best practice, for example, fixing issues fully, like I mentioned before about just patchworking over manual processes and not having everything automated. And I think that mindset is the most important.
We are on time for the day. Apologies for those of you wanting more. You'll have to give Chris, Messrs, Kirby and Osborne a buzz, either on LinkedIn or email if you want to chat, or you download the white paper itself. You go to the lacepartners.com website, you go to the insights section, you can find it. Or if you go to the payroll services page, we've actually got a button on there which will take you to the white paper. Chris, thank you very much, as always, for joining me.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure as always.
And Nick, great to have you on for your debut.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.
It's been great. I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as we've enjoyed it recording it. If you'd like to suggest any kind of payroll-related topics that you'd like us to cover, please feel free to reach out. On behalf of myself, Chris and Nick, thank you very much for listening. We'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.